Hello, dear friends. Today we will continue our journey through Otto Carius's memoirs. This part of his memoirs is full of events. I was most impressed by the episode involving the criminal negligence of a German officer, which led to the disaster that befell his unit. Equally memorable for me was the tragic fate of the German soldiers who thought they were sleeping in safety. Don't forget to leave your opinion about this material and support this video with a like. Well, let's begin. Retreat to Narva. Gatchina had to be abandoned, and Army Group North moved to the rear along the Gatchina, Volosovo, Narva highway. They said that amazing positions had been created along the Narva. Behind the Panther defensive line, it was possible to hold the defense after the order to withdraw troops. As experienced soldiers, we were skeptical, even though they talked about massive bunkers and fortified tank positions. It would have been great for our infantry comrades to have good bunkers, because at that time of year, it was practically impossible to build fortified positions. Our skepticism was well-founded. The Panther defensive line existed only on paper. None of those who retreated there later regretted that those responsible for the defensive positions were brought to justice. While the process of returning to reality upon arrival at the positions in Narva was unpleasant, there was again a bright spot in another area. We formed a rear guard with Wengler's infantry, and our working relationship with this regiment turned out to be amazing. Our task, to cover the retreat of all infantry and artillery units from the Gatchina-Leningrad area, was not an easy one. Almost all units had to be transported back along a single highway. Therefore, we had to move ahead to clear the highway. Again, the Ivans could attack the rear guard. At times, we moved north to keep the enemy away from the highway and thwart their attempts to catch up with us. Once, we advanced again towards the coast and took up positions in an empty village. The edge of the forest stretched for about a kilometer beyond the village, almost halfway between the highway and the coast. We positioned ourselves at the edge of the village. By evening, several late infantrymen had arrived. Both groups were satisfied, as we also felt more confident with the support of the infantry. When it got dark, I saw a Russian reconnaissance group coming out of the forest, probably to find out if the village was occupied by the enemy. They were moving quite boldly towards us. About 500 meters away from us, the Russians suddenly jumped into a roadside ditch. We opened fire, but several men from their group managed to escape into the forest. This meant that the Russians already controlled the area stretching out right in front of us. Nights are long when you're on watch in a tank. Minutes turn into hours, especially in winter when the day ends at 3 p.m. and doesn't start again until 9 a.m. I made it a rule to stay in the turret myself and not take turns. I knew how easy it was to fall asleep when you were exhausted, and I didn't want to ask too much of my subordinates. Besides, they needed rest to be ready for any unforeseen problems. Of course, sometimes my head would hit the edge of the turret if I started to nod off, and that always proved to be a very invigorating remedy. If I was smoking, I often didn't notice that I had dozed off until the burning end of the cigarette burned my fingers. In this state, I often had visions. They took the form of trucks, tanks, and similar things, which in daylight turned out to be harmless trees or bushes. At times, we would fire a signal flare to survey the surrounding area. But after the flash faded, the night became even darker than before. Once we realized that we were only giving away our location and seeing very little ourselves, we tried to avoid these fireworks whenever possible. Of course, it was a different matter in combat. We had to give the gunner a chance to take aim. This was impossible if the moon did not facilitate accurate shooting. At one point, we received parachute flares that burned longer. They are associated with a tragicomic incident in my tank, I received a flare gun that was passed to me and wanted to cock the trigger, but I did not do it completely. The trigger moved forward, and the rocket launcher fired inside the tank. The rocket flew around like a cat that had been set on fire. This rocket burns for an incredibly long time if you wait for it to finally go out. We were very lucky that no one was hurt during this incident. For 4 hours, we stood guard outside the village without incident. Suddenly, around 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard mortar fire. The strikes came in 2 short bursts, but there was no doubt they were meant for us. Soon, the village was under heavy fire. The Russians noticed that it was occupied and wanted to finish off the enemy before moving further west. However, their actions showed that they certainly did not expect to find a whole company of Tigers in the village. I saw the muzzles of guns spewing fire at the edge of the forest. The flashes appeared one after another, moving further and further to the right. These must have been tanks moving along the edge of the forest. They wanted to reach the road at the opposite end of the village. Pz.VI was positioned there. Behind him was von Schiller's tank. I radioed Sveti. From the flashes, I could tell that the T-34 was moving no more than 50 meters away from Sveti. Because of the shooting, we couldn't hear the noise of the engines. For this reason, the enemy had already advanced towards the village. Sveti set fire to the tank closest to him, but we were astonished to see that the second T-34 was moving down the middle of the village street, very close to von Schiller. It often proved fatal for the Russians that they remained completely closed off. Because of this, they could see almost nothing, especially at night. They also often put infantry on their tanks, but even they did not recognize the situation until it was too late. Von Schiller began to turn his turret, but in doing so, he hit a Russian tank with his gun. He had to reverse first in order to knock the tank out. I didn't feel confident enough to fire. One of the most ridiculous situations I have ever experienced. After Zveti had destroyed 3 more tanks, the Russians retreated. Obviously, they had suffered enough losses. We maintained radio contact with each other for the rest of the night and could hear the Russians' communications quite clearly on one of the frequencies. This meant that they could not be too far away from us. When dawn broke, our infantrymen approached the T-34 somewhat carelessly. It was still standing next to von Schiller's tank. Except for a hole in the hull, there was no other visible damage. Surprisingly, when they approached to open the hatch, it would not budge. Immediately afterwards, a hand grenade flew out of the tank and 3 soldiers were seriously wounded. Von Schiller opened fire on the enemy again. However, the commander of the Russian tank did not leave his vehicle until the 3rd shot. Then, seriously wounded, he lost consciousness. The other Russians were dead. We brought the Soviet lieutenant to the division, but it was already too late to interrogate him. He died of his wounds on the way. This incident showed us how careful we had to be. This Russian was sending detailed reports about us to his unit. All he had to do was slowly turn his turret to shoot von Schiller at point-blank range. I remember how we were outraged by the stubbornness of this Soviet lieutenant at the time. Today, I have a different opinion about this. The withdrawal of the Army Group North troops was significantly disrupted by Russian actions from the flanks. The road along which the retreating units were moving became increasingly congested with troops pushing against each other, as the enemy increasingly blocked this route. We had to ensure free passage all the time. During this process, we were often amazed by the exemplary military discipline of our opponents. In one case, we were able to repel an attack that was executed as if it were a training exercise. The Russians attacked a few kilometers west of us with a fully equipped infantry regiment, supported by tanks. They were moving from north to south along our retreat route. We approached them from the east along their left flank. Then, we witnessed a spectacle rarely seen in war. The Russians left their flanks unprotected, as they often did, and performed a maneuver in front of us as if it were a training exercise. We stopped at the edge of the village and opened fire. For a while, the enemy tanks fell victim to our fire. These losses did not seem to bother the Russian infantry at all, and they continued to advance as if nothing had happened. Never before had two Russians run side by side at the same time. After 3 or 4 steps, they disappeared again, falling to the ground. They reached the highway without the support of armored vehicles, so we had to clear it again. The spectacle we witnessed proved once again how useful military training is and how insignificant losses can be when every soldier knows his maneuver. As soon as we finished clearing the retreat route along the front, the situation immediately began to heat up from the rear. This abnormal situation continued all the way to Narva. One night, the Russians even managed to surround the divisional command post. It was not difficult for us to knock them back again, as the Russians could only carry out their flanking maneuvers with mobile units, that is, motorized infantry with light anti-tank guns and light tanks. In the morning, the headquarters was able to continue moving. The general was the last to leave in my tank. We found ourselves in a difficult position just before the fork in the road at Volosovo. We were carrying out the task of defending the position in front of the village of Opole at all costs until the order to leave came. We were on the southern edge of the highway. The village was about 100 meters away on the other side of the road. In the morning, the enemy was still nowhere to be seen, and the rear guard of the troops passed us. An infantry battalion provided cover for our 4 Tigers. Since many units were not motorized, the withdrawal proceeded in fits and starts. Except for a small number of stragglers, the highway was virtually empty by evening, and the village in front of us became lively. We saw figures of people running back and forth, but we had to stay alert. The night promised to be very pleasant again. With the onset of darkness, the infantry battalion also left. I was left alone with my 4 Tigers in the whole area. Fortunately, the Russians were unaware of our predicament. Perhaps they also overestimated us. In any case, they set up anti-tank guns opposite us twice, but we never let them fire more than once. They did not attempt a third time. The Russian commander seemed to believe that we would also leave in the morning. In any case, he assumed that we had all kinds of infantry with us. Otherwise, he would probably have approached our tanks on foot. Shortly after midnight, vehicles appeared from the west. We recognized them as our own in time. It was a motorized infantry battalion that had not managed to join up with the troops and had advanced to the highway late. As I later learned, the commander was sitting in the only tank at the head of the column. He was completely drunk. The disaster happened with lightning speed. The entire unit had no idea what was going on and was moving openly through an area that was being fired upon by the Russians. Terrible panic broke out when the machine guns and mortars started firing. Many soldiers were hit by bullets. Left without a commander, everyone ran back to the road instead of seeking cover to the south of it. All mutual assistance vanished. The only thing that mattered was every man for himself. Vehicles drove straight over the wounded, and the highway was a scene of horror. All this misery could have been prevented if the commander of this rabble had done his duty and led his men across the rough terrain instead of sitting in a tank and sleeping off his drunkenness. After the Russian fire subsided, the radio operators and commanders of our Tigers got out and crawled to the highway to at least save the seriously wounded. We took care of them as best we could and placed them on the tanks. This rescue work was complicated by the fact that it had to be done by moonlight. The Russians could see all our actions from their houses, while we could only recognize the enemy by the flashes of fire from their batteries. Our position was becoming increasingly precarious. I contacted the battalion every 15 minutes, but there was no response to my request for instructions. The Russians opened very unpleasant barrage mortar fire at regular intervals without approaching us. Nevertheless, the damage was quite serious. By evening, Sergeant Vizell reported to me that his tank's radiator had been punctured. The same report came in half an hour later from the second tank. This meant that we would have to tow both vehicles with the 2 other tanks that were still operational. We couldn't afford to lose them all, because we knew how difficult it was to get new tanks. It was hard for the drivers to leave their vehicles, just as it was hard for horsemen in the old days to leave their horses. I reported the situation to the battalion. About 20 minutes later, the long-awaited order arrived. We hooked up the 2 disabled tanks as best we could and towed them 2 kilometers to the Army food warehouse, which was already burning fiercely. Naturally, our soldiers, who could not take everything with them, did not want to leave anything behind for the Russians. Then we turned south off the highway because, according to the latest reports, the Russians had already reached the highway and were advancing westward along it. It was impossible to break through there. The bright flames from the burning food warehouse were still reflecting on us. We got out of the vehicles again and secured the cables properly. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shook the air. The shock wave knocked us to the ground. At the same time, the food we had been waiting for so long literally fell spinning from the sky onto us. Among other things, there were quite a few boards and beams of all sizes, and we were very lucky not to have been injured in such an inglorious way. The company sappers who blew up the warehouse did a great job. It seemed that a little more and the whole place would blow up. We were not tempted by the rare opportunity to die a heroic death from canned food. Therefore, we hurried to get out of there as quickly as possible. Thanks to the frost, our road south of the highway was quite passable. In the morning twilight, I noticed a car approaching us. We were all happy when we recognized our commander. Without a moment's hesitation, he drove out to meet us, even though there were no German soldiers in sight, and the Russians could appear at any moment. Major Yetta literally hugged me and admitted that he had sent us the order to retreat. He was happy that we had even taken the broken-down vehicles with us. Unfortunately, we had a tragic incident with the infantrymen we took with us on the last leg of the journey. The soldiers were exhausted and could hardly walk, so they sat in the stern, settling above the cooling fans where warm air came out of the engine and transmission compartment. They soon fell asleep and were poisoned because the cooled air mixed with the exhaust fumes. Despite all efforts to revive them, 3 of them could not be saved. At that time, we were not so cautious, but after this incident, we warned every soldier about the possible danger. The road junction at Volosovo had to be defended with all forces to ensure the transfer of all army units back to Narva. Colonel Wengler took up a defensive position with his infantry on the eastern edge of Volosovo. The rest of our battalion was assigned to defend this line together with all anti-tank units. It was not possible to break through to Volosovo without incident. Major Yeti explained to us that we would have to take a long detour. Because of this, we had to make a detour to the north, back to the highway. It was very kind of the Major to hide from us the fact that the Ivans had already reached the highway just before Volosovo. We just needed to find a way to get west. This seemed practically impossible during the day, so we waited for nightfall. Before setting off, Major Yeti took a good swig of alcohol and sat down at the feet of the loader in my tank. What else could he do but trust in fate? In order to use the firepower of the two towed vehicles, we turned their turrets backward. This way, their crews could cover the rear. As soon as we drove onto the road and turned west, a Russian anti-tank gun hit the turret from behind. However, the towed vehicle soon gave us a chance to catch our breath. Despite this, we had to get out because the Russians had cut the tow rope. We still had 3 kilometers to go before reaching the new line. Of course, the Russians on both sides of the highway wanted to finish us off. Some of them jumped onto our tanks, but they couldn't do anything. In this case, our hand grenades hit their target. Either they were scared off by the swearing of my steadfast driver Kessler, or it was unclear where the Ivans had gone. Shortly before we reached our destination, anti-tank guns began firing at us. Our comrades thought we were the enemy, and until we responded with the same caliber, they did not calm down. An amateur would probably argue that we could have given ourselves away by the flashes. Of course, we did. But who cares about flashes during such a retreat when it is unknown whether they are caused by Ivan's guns or our own comrades? In Volosovo, we found the remnants of a company. Significant forces were ready to defend. Colonel Wengler's soldiers were already building a line of defense around this place. Only the road west to Narva remained open. I was assigned to Colonel Wengler with 4 of my battle-ready Tigers. The rest of the battalion had already been sent to the railway station, where all the heavy weapons were loaded onto a train to avoid further losses. Later, we would be very happy to be able to use the firepower of the super heavy artillery batteries that had been saved in the manner described above. Colonel Wengler was responsible for the defense of Volosovo. Later, in honor of his infantrymen, it was always called Wenglerovo. Wengler was a model military commander, a reservist who served as a bank director in peacetime. He commanded the complete trust of his subordinates. They were ready to go through hell under his command. He possessed remarkable composure, an invaluable quality in critical situations. Once, we were having a briefing on the situation in a small wooden house about 100 meters from the front line. The Russians were firing from 3 sides, and it was not very pleasant. Wengler was giving a brief overview of the situation when a mortar shell explosion blew out the window. One officer was slightly wounded in the arm and sought shelter under the table. Our colonel just looked calmly in his direction and said, "Gentlemen, don't let the shooting drive you crazy. Let's not get distracted from the topic of discussion so we can finish quickly and return to our seats." We instantly regained our composure. Only a leader who controls himself can demand full commitment from his subordinates. In Volosovo, we met the soldiers of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps for the first time. Their greatest claim to fame in the future was that they held their position at Narva. We were excited to meet them, as we had always envied them for their superior equipment. We were pleasantly surprised. Their recklessness inspired us all the time, even though their ruthless attitude towards people and equipment somewhat alienated us from them. Where SS units were used, things worked out, but the casualties were often so great that troops had to be withdrawn for reorganization. We couldn't afford that. We had to protect our people and equipment. My goal has always been to achieve as much success as possible with the least possible losses. The Russians then began to press with all their might on Wenglerovo. We were all happy when the order to retreat finally came. Our special platforms had already been delivered to the railway station. We headed west at full speed towards Narva. During loading, we received the sad news that the commander of the 1st Company, Oberleutnant Dils, had been killed. A Russian tank fired at the highway, and a shell fragment pierced the heart of Dils, who was sitting in his car. That's all for today. If you liked the video, please support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. See you all soon.